everyone. I'm Derek Chollet at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I'd like to welcome you to today's book talk with Colin Woodard, about his terrific book called Union, The Struggle to Forge the Story of the United States. Colin is a well-known author, journalist. He writes for the Portland Press Herald. He is an award-winning journalist. He's written many books on the American idea and how we became known as Americans. He's written a terrific book called American Nations, American Character, and this recent book, Union, sort of ties it all together. Colin, I think we could probably think of these books as a trilogy in a way, and hopefully we can talk about some of your earlier books in talking about Union. In this book, Colin tackles a very big topic, which is America's origin story. Such questions as what does it mean to be a nation, and how does this idea of a nation come about? And Colin writes this in a very interesting and I think compelling way, because it's about big ideas, but it's also about people. And this book, Union, sketches the stories of 5 individuals who, over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, were seminal in the debate about what it meant to be an American and what an American nation was. And I think these debates are very resonant still today. And so Colin's book, although a work of history and a work of biography, I think I found it to be a very, very insightful guide to understanding much of what we are reading in the news today. And I think particularly for audiences here in the United States or around the world trying to understand the United States and trying to understand what's happening, I think Colin's book, Union, is a terrific place to start. So Colin, welcome. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So Colin and I are going to speak amongst ourselves here for about 20 minutes or so, but very much want to encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A on Zoom, and we'll get right into it. Colin, I'd like to start a question by quoting back to you a part of your book, a line from your book early on, and I think in the first chapter, in which you say the U.S. was a state in search of nationhood. To me, that brought to mind actually a line from the Broadway play Hamilton, where early in the play Hamilton, the character Alexander Hamilton asks, are we a nation of states? Question mark. What is the state of our nation? So to your quote, what did you mean by the U.S. was a state in search of nationhood?
Right. Well, one of my previous books, American Nations, made the argument that there's never been one America, but rather several Americas, and that the distinction between those Americas, which in many ways have aspects of nationhood, of being stateless nations, that each of those ties back to the differences between the different groupings of colonial cultures along what's now the eastern and southwestern rims of the United States. In other words, that there are separate Americas founded in the Puritans of New England, in the Dutch settled area right around New York City, in the Appalachian Scots-Irish settled backcountry, in the tidewater of the Chesapeake, where the younger sons of Southern English gentry held sway, in the southwest of the country that was originally colonized south to north by Spain, and so on and so forth. And that each of these separate nations or regional cultures settled mutually exclusive tiers of what's now the United States, really without much external contest until the 1830s or 1840s. So when I set about to write Union, which is in a sense asking the question, when did we begin to think otherwise? Where did the idea, the sort of myth that Americans, that the United States, that we all share an origin story going deep back in time and share a sense of purpose, where did that come from? Because clearly it happened. It came from somewhere, and those of us, we grew up with those ideas in the United States. But I knew that from doing American Nations and my other work that that was not true as late as the 1850s and 1860s during the Civil War era. So my effort was to figure out, when and by whom and why did that narrative get created to get around the American nations problem. So when you raise very correctly that one of the key themes in the book is that we found ourselves in the aftermath of the revolution with a sort of state without any of the characteristics or story of who we were supposed to be. These different regional cultures had been rivals and often enemies throughout the colonial period. I mean, even going to war and different regional cultures siding, say, with different sides of the major conflicts of the period, like the English Civil War of the 1640s, with one invading the other. The Dutch were in fact conquered in New Amsterdam, by the English, and then that led to tensions that continue today within the state of New York between the upstate and the lower part, which have never been even settled by the same groups of people with the same attitudes. So, understanding that they came together to face off a shared threat, an existential threat from a change in British colonial policy that wanted to bring all of its colonies to heel, stop these idiosyncrasies between the different colonies, and make them all sort of submit to a more standardized imperial vision like the other kings had with their empires. And that was a threat to each of these regional cultures. So they joined together and lo and behold, won a war of liberation. But that meant that sort of accidentally, they found themselves in this sort of entity together. There'd been created during the war a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army. And then with the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution, there'd been sort of an effort to create, I guess, kind of like a treaty organization. These different sovereign and independent states would delegate foreign policy and trade controls, kind of like a European Union in a way. Right. That was the default. And nobody was sure if there was going to be a United States, what that meant. Would it be a federation, a treaty, an alliance, or was it supposed to become a real nation like post-revolutionary France or Holland or Prussia seemed to be creating? And all the way through to the beginnings of the story told in Union, that was still very much an open question, right up into the 1820s and 1830s, when the narrative in Union really gets going. People didn't know. If you asked them what country they were from, people would still say, well, South Carolina or Massachusetts. They referred to themselves as Americans only in the same sense that, Germans or English or people would refer to themselves as Europeans at the time. But that couldn't stand. After the War of 1812 and with the death and the passing of the scene of the revolutionary generation in the 1820s and 1830s, the old ad hoc solutions to kick the can down the road were no longer going to work. It was becoming imperative that there be answers. The original answer, what brings us together, is the shared glory of having won the American Revolution and the sort of beatification of George Washington as the founder of the country. That held for a generation, but it was getting old when the memories were passing from the scene, and the tensions inherent in the profound differences, religiously, ethnographically, and really ideologically between the different regional cultures and the states they controlled, particularly over slavery, but that brought all sorts of implications about fundamental values about who we are and what the Constitution means and all the rest. The can could no longer be kicked down the road. They're needed for, really as a national security priority, answers had to be created and found for what the United States is, where it came from, and where it is going, and who belongs.
Right, and I think that's a very interesting point, that in many ways, it was the international dimension of it, which was an impetus behind the idea that there needed to be something more definable as American. Also seems to me that the idea that we were such a young country that was in many ways running away from the past, and we were looking towards the future and new, helped create this idea that we didn't need to worry about the past. We were trying to build a future. But I guess this gets to the question, before we get to the characters, because I think that those are so important, but before we get this question of when did it this idea congeal that we're American, and how did it congeal? Like, what was the ways in which that began to sort of take shape?
Well, the characters I've chosen to tell the story are some of the key figures that prosecute and fight that battle with one another to answer that question. But the broadly speaking, starting in the 1830s, a draft idea of what the United States is, how we would define it, what its origin story is, and what its purpose is. Its national narrative, as it were being created. Because this audience will understand this very quickly, but a lot of audiences, particularly in American, don't think about this, that nations and nation states are a relatively new idea, and they're an abstraction, right? Sometime between the Peace of Westphalia and the 19th century, these ideas had to come together. And for each aspiring nation, you needed a story that was compelling enough to convince individuals that they somehow belonged to and had great allegiance to this nation you've just defined, be it Germany or Japan, or in much more complicated fashion, a nation like the first incarnation of Yugoslavia, or Canada, or the United States, where you need a story of belonging and purpose that is convincing enough that people will, and ultimately be willing to give their lives for it if called upon. I mean, that's a pretty high bar to set. And so it was necessary for the United States, as a place that actually didn't have any of the easy ingredients for creating a story of nationhood. We couldn't just turn and say, oh, well, we have a shared ethnicity, because we didn't. We have a shared history. No, each of these colonial projects was set out in a completely different time by a totally different group of people with completely different goals, and sometimes operating from different empires who were enemies with one another, so that didn't work. You couldn't say that this had been our homeland off into the mists of time, somebody, the Hungarians could, or the Basques, or somebody, because everybody knew exactly when the colonial project showed up and that they'd pushed aside the people who might be able to make such a claim. There wasn't a shared religion. I mean, all of the things that were easily at hand were not available. So this was a particular challenge, and there were a couple ways in which you could solve this. And two competing ideas quickly emerged, carried forth by some of my characters, a tension between a civic national definition of what the United States would be and an ethno-nationalist one.
Well, that's a great transition to get into the characters, because, as I said at the outset, this book is about big ideas, but it's told through 5 very compelling stories of individuals, some of which are going to be familiar names to our audience, a few of which may not be very familiar. And so, Colin, if you could, why don't we just go through each of them? If you could give a sense of who they were and why they mattered to your story. And we'll go roughly in chronological order, starting with George Bancroft.
Sure. And just briefly, I mean, I told this story in narrative fashion, driven by these characters and their lives and biographies. The structure of it is actually these separate characters with their separate parallel storylines that then collide, as you would see in fiction. I mean, that's useful for a broad audience, because the historiography of ideas is a pretty abstract idea, and that this is more compelling. But more importantly, it's, I think, the way to do this thing, because ideas are the most powerful force, really, in human civilization, and yet they are abstractions. But they're, the people who come up with them in the context of, who their parents and family were, what their conditions were growing up, who their friends were, who their enemies were, who confronted them, what were the times they lived in. And by seeing the creation, the germination of an idea through the people who ultimately, packaged it and most prominently promoted it, and the clashes between them, allow you to understand not only how these particular ideas happened, but how the battle over ideas, how they transition from a thought in somebody's head to being in the zeitgeist and actually being part of our shared consciousness. The book, by doing it that way, attempts to do all of those things at the same time, primarily in the context of the 19th and 20th century. So,
yeah. Well, just before you, let me interrupt real quick, just because I want to put in a plug for the readers out there, which is you do something that's unusual for ideas books, which is, and you pull it off quite nicely, which is there's a lot of short chapters, and it reads more like a Stephen King novel or Da Vinci Code, or perhaps like an Eric Larson book, and the pacing works quite well, and showing how these stories work in parallel, but then also intersect at very interesting and revealing moments. So with that, George Bancroft.
Yeah. And that was exactly the idea. It has like 70 or 80 chapters, not 12 or 13,
right,
because you move between the characters. And so the characters that I'm about to speak about briefly are characters who were the key packagers and carriers of these two different traditions, and through their waypoints, you can understand the battle over the United States nationhood story. And the first one, the person who first really put together a draft that was broadly disseminated and embraced or criticized of what the United States should be, was George Bancroft, the eminent 19th century historian. He's largely forgotten today, but he was absolutely the most influential single figure in American history writing during the course of the 19th century, which he lived through. He was born in 1800 and didn't die until the early 1890s, and was active in his scholarship through much of that time period. A figure who met John Adams, who interviewed some of the early founders, who was an ally of James Madison, and who on his death, the Spanish-American War was coming up pretty soon. So he's an incredible span of history. But he was very much a New Englander. He was the son of a congregational minister, descendant of early Puritans. He'd gone to Phillips Exeter and Harvard, graduated as a young man in 1817, at 17 years old. And I tell this because a key moment was when President Kirkland, the president of Harvard at the time, tapped him to be sent to Europe to get something that almost nobody in American arts and letters had, a doctoral degree. There were no, PhD doctoral programs in existence in North America. And in fact, almost the only place you could go to do it was in Germany, where the universities that were creating this new ideas of learning based on, rational examination of evidence and the facts. And Kirkland was well aware that Harvard and all of its peers in the Americas were essentially, glorified boarding schools. They'd all grown out of being theological seminaries. And he wanted to start creating the underpinnings of what you and I would all recognize as sort of a modern research university. Mm-hmm. To do that, he needed professors. So he tapped Edward Everett and George Bancroft and other promising young men who had graduated to send them on scholarship to get PhDs at the universities of Germany. And so at 17 years old, George Bancroft was sent to Göttingen and then later went to Berlin, where he he studied under some of the key figures in Central European, discourse of nationalism, the great romantic, nation building figures. He studied under Hegel and the von Humboldts and Hering and Schlegel. He took epic, the equivalent of backpacking tours through Europe with letters of introduction from all of these people. So he was hanging out with Goethe at his house. He, ran into Lord Byron and his mistress on the USS Constitution when it was anchored in port in Italy, and spent a whole day with them at their villa. In Paris, he was going to dinner parties regularly with Lafayette, and walking the countryside with Washington Irving. And he essentially met at 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, all of the sort of key figures of his era in the world of letters, and was essentially welcomed into that club as one of the only Americans who were very young in his career. And through all that, he had, because people saw him as an American in Europe, he was thinking of himself as an American more and more than as a Massachusettsian person. And when he returned to the United States, he failed at a number of pursuits, including being a preacher and being an academic and starting a school, before he ended up settling on this project to give the young United States a story of itself, in the same sort of project that he'd seen his teachers and counterparts in the German Confederation trying to do for Germany, but from a different starting point. And so he did this through the vehicle of a 10-volume history of the United States. The first volume of which he published in the early 1830s, and the last volume wouldn't come out until the 1870s, with further revisions all the way through nearly to his death in the early 1890s. And it was really a prehistory. His 10 volumes only got you to the eve of the Constitutional Convention in 1789. It was a story of what our supposedly shared origins were as a single country destined for great things. And this story, this national narrative, was broadly and quickly embraced. His histories, one after another, were bestsellers of their time period. It influenced the way people talked about what the United States was, taught about its history, debated things. It was the framework and remained the framework in one form or another, well, all the way through to today in certain aspects. And it is from Bancroft that this idea that what the United States shares is a fealty to a set of ideals. To be an American is to have fealty to the ideals set forth in the opening of the Declaration of Independence, our founding document and opening statement as to who we were supposed to be, about the inherent equality of humans, about their right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and representative self-government, that was it, and that we had been destined to do these things. He was taking the ideas that he'd learned in Germany about sort of historicism, that history had a plan and that we were all just caught up in it. He substituted in, from his own Puritan tradition, the idea that God was involved, that God had chosen the American people for this purpose, to carry the baton of human freedom forward and to carry it forward across this vast and supposedly virgin continent. He didn't use the words manifest destiny, but somebody reviewing his book did, and all of those ideas were imbued in it. So the idea that we actually did have common origin stories, that despite how different South Carolina and Massachusetts and Tennessee appeared on the surface, that when they were all settled, they were settled with the same copies of the same seed, because his German teachers had believed that nations were organisms that unfolded from a set of encoded plans, and that it was inevitable what sort of plant each seed would produce. And Bancroft essentially argued that the same seed had been planted in all of the colonies, and unbeknownst to all of us, we were destined to come together in the Revolution, that God was involved in the founding and the writing of the Constitution, and that we would inevitably carry forth across the continent. So a civic national vision that, in theory, was universally open. If what was required to be an American is fealty to those ideals, then anyone who has fealty to those ideals could become an American, and that the United States is an exceptional nation, that we're destined for great things, and that we're chosen in some way, the same way that Bancroft's Puritan forefathers, believed they were in a, Old Testament style, covenanted relationship with God to do certain things, an errand in the wilderness and all the rest. So this is the starting and first, take on what our nationhood was to be, but it was promptly and quickly contested.
And so before we get to the contestation of that, what national figures sort of seized the Bancroft argument?
It was quickly seized throughout, what we would think of as the North very promptly, right? And it was an optimistic vision that many people could seize upon, because, what's better than having been chosen by God to do incredible things, and that, freedom and all that is our birthright and our destiny. And sure. It allowed you to squint and avoid all of the unfortunate aspects of our balkanized nationhood. So a lot of people had a lot of reasons to embrace this, but the problem was that those opening ideals in the Declaration of Independence were not broadly shared, particularly in the South, because in the end, you cannot square the idea of all humans being created equal with unalienable rights with a race-based slave and caste system backed by horrific violence. And in fact, in the Deep South, in an oligarchical system designed to be hierarchical and unequal, right? They, the great thinkers of the Deep South and the Tidewater were explicit in their arguments against equality and against that Jefferson was wrong. I mean, they said that. You could almost quote them saying those exact things. So there was quickly an opposition movement, largely based in those regions, that took issue with this set of ideals being the key, because it was incompatible with life there, and you could only square the Declaration of Independence with the realities of a slaveholding republic like that if you started tweaking things. The only path that allows you to do both things at once is to declare that certain people aren't actually humans and therefore don't have all those rights, which is what leads us into the ethno-national idea, where only certain people, have the right of nationhood, even if they happen to be living within the nation.
Yeah. And setting in place the caste system, as you pointed out, which is a great segue into the next character in your book, William Gilmore Simms, someone who's probably not as well known to many listeners, but plays a very important role in defining this ethno-nationalism that you describe.
Absolutely. And I should say briefly on Bancroft, not only did he write these things, but he actually was active in politics. He was the Democratic Party boss in Massachusetts. He then served in the Polk administration as Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy. It is he who founded the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. It's he who wrote the orders which caused the Texas War and the annexation of Texas, and for his naval commanders to seize Spanish posts in California, leading to the annexation of California. He served as our ambassador in England and later in Bismarck's Germany. So he was not just a guy in an ivory tower, but was
right
there as well. But William Gilmore Simms is also forgotten today, but that would have been amazing to early 19th century intellectuals and thinkers and readers, because he was one of the most successful and best-selling authors and historians of his age, and the undisputed leading man of letters of the antebellum South and later of the Confederacy. His books were read all over the place, and he was from Charleston and was a contemporary and for a while friend of George Bancroft's. But he put forward very quickly, when Bancroft's vision was starting to appear on the stage and be circulated around what was then the Internet of Ideas, right? You would write a book and you would give speeches. A newspaper correspondent in your town would transcribe and write out your entire speech as a dispatch in his paper and print it out, and they would get put in the mail, and other newspaper editors would find it like a tweet, and they would, if they wanted, reprint it. They would retweet it for their audience. Sometimes they would put a comment on the top of it, like a comment tweet, and only use certain passages. It moved slower than Twitter, but that's essentially how things moved around and how the conversation and debate would happen. Other people would write another article or another book refuting you, and then the process would continue again. And it's there through speeches, books, and this, sort of 19th century Internet of Ideas that these things percolated. And Simms jumped into it, and he founded Southern Journals. He wrote responses to all of this, and it boiled down to an argument that said, no, as I said before, that Jefferson is wrong, that humans are clearly not equal, and that the real republic we should be looking for is a classical republicanism, modeled off the slave states of antiquity, of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where a small minority had the liberty or the privilege to practice democracy, and the vast majority of the population were subservient or in fact enslaved, and that this is how it should be and it has been since the ancient times. And that what actually draws Americans together isn't this set of false ideals, but rather their shared belonging in the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race. And his view was that the states are the sovereign nations, that South Carolina and Massachusetts and Virginia are all the real nations, and that the United States as a federation existed to protect them and allow them to carry forth in fruition, but the common denominator was this Anglo-Saxon heritage, and that other people were on a provisional basis, whether or not they would be entitled to the same rights in the United States as the Anglo-Saxons did, and that certain races and people clearly were lacking either culturally or perhaps genetically, although he wouldn't have used those words, would be incapable of self-government and must be excluded for the good of all. So in other words, a white supremacist argument, which emerged within a year of this other argument. In other words, this white supremacist national narrative, which would be picked up by others and would be leading towards the Civil War and its aftermath, and is still with us today, goes back as far as our civic national one. And I think that's something that many Americans don't realize about their own history, is just how far back that particular curse goes.
Mm-hmm. Well, this leads us to the next character, a person that you describe as a founding father of the liberal democratic republic in the United States.
Yeah,
that's
the pivotal figure.
Frederick Douglass.
Absolutely, and Douglas is the pivotal figure in the narrative for this reason. I mean, I think everyone knows out there, but in case you're not familiar with his biography, he was born into slavery in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. He taught himself to read and to write sort of covertly and with the help of sympathetic, people on his plantation, and later sympathetic masters and other, immigrant street children on the streets of Baltimore, where he was living for a time. And he wanted to escape slavery, and did, in a most extraordinary fashion. He escaped to the North using the most advanced technology of the period. It'd be like, hopping on SpaceX to get out and escape. He hopped on one of the very first passenger trains that existed, connecting Baltimore with Philadelphia and beyond, which was closely guarded to make sure that no slaves escaped. He did it in disguise with false papers and various twists and turns, got himself to New York, was greeted and escorted through the Underground Railway to the relative safety of New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he worked as a day laborer until he was discovered by the Garrisonians, by the most prominent abolitionists in the North, who encountered him and then realized that not only did this man have an incredible firsthand story to tell about what it was like to be a slave, to live in slavery, and about the moral corrosion that it had on master and slaves alike, but that he told it staggeringly well. He was an incredibly gifted orator, and later they realized an incredibly gifted writer. And they snapped him up, put him on their speaker circuit, started sending him all over the United States. He was a superstar. He quickly outgrew the Garrisonians, didn't agree with them politically, had his own stage, ended up fleeing at one point to Ireland and England, toured to massive audiences there, and became one of the most famous people of his era. And the entire time, what he was doing with that voice of his was not just telling his particular story, but taking up the civic national vision, which he would do for the rest of his life, as to what the United States should be, but with a clear eye as to where the United States really stood in relation to those ideals. Bancroft believed that we were just destined by God to achieve all of these ideals, and that we just had to sit back and wait. Everything is preordained. Don't try to push things. Don't try to enact reforms because everything's in good hand. We'll eventually achieve, the grand stage of freedom. And nothing would shake Bancroft from that belief, not the Civil War, not the failure of Reconstruction, nothing. But Douglas knew firsthand all the hypocrisies of the United States, how it wasn't meeting these ideals. He believed them to be great ideals, and essentially was imploring white Northern Americans to embrace them and fight for those ideals in the years living up to the Civil War, to fight for them during Reconstruction and during the Southern-led campaign of terror to successfully roll back the political emancipation of African Americans in the South. He lived through all of this all the way into the 1890s as well, and used his skills to fight for that vision at a time when that vision was in retreat and collapsing. And in doing so, he created sometimes the best and most moving descriptions of what the United States is supposed to be in that civic national tradition that have ever been put together, and extended them not just to African Americans. I mean, he quickly became friends with a local farmer in Rochester, New York, where he moved at one point, who was the father of Susan B. Anthony, and became an ally. He was one of the only male speakers at the Seneca Falls Women's Convention, and helped push the tide of the convention towards the convention endorsing the idea of women's suffrage when it was still controversial even within women's rights circles. He fought, in his speeches, articulated and fought for whoever the condemned others were of the day, whether it was the Irish immigrants or the Chinese during the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or Jewish people, whoever they were. He was arguing that everyone belongs in this United States if they share that fealty to those ideals, and America should achieve them. So he's a extremely important figure in all of this. David Blight's biography has made Douglas, rightly given him a spotlight and made him a major figure. That came out, when I was finishing up the writing of the second half of the book. So, Blight is absolutely right about that, of course, and Douglas is a central figure to the American story, to a degree that I think has been underappreciated, at least until the past year and a half, by Americans at large.
I agree. And I think your book and Blight's book do go a long ways in trying to amend that gross oversight of Douglas in our historical memory. So the fourth character I'd like you to talk about is a historian that maybe many of our listeners might be familiar with, Frederick Jackson Turner.
Right. So then the last two figures in this book, Douglas is a little bit younger than Bancroft and Sims, but overlaps with them. These last two figures are a generation younger. They were children during the Civil War, and they grew up and sort of reached the sort of climaxes of their careers at the very end of the early 19th and the century and into the first 2 decades of the 20th. And the first of those is Frederick Jackson Turner, which most people will know that name as the famous 19th and early 20th century historian associated with his frontier thesis. Now, unlike all of the other figures in this book, Turner was not from the eastern seaboard of the United States, but rather was from Wisconsin. He grew up in Portage, Wisconsin, in the western part of the state, again, during the Civil War, at a time when that part of the state was still the frontier. There were still Native American trading camps outside his village, and people cutting down, virgin forests to build, log cabins and all of the rest. And he saw the American story from what was then a Western, but a Midwestern and far Western perspective, unlike the others. And what he is most associated with, this frontier thesis, is the idea that what made Americans Americans was not all of their ties back to, either the Anglo-Saxon motherlands of England, and before that, the Black Forest of Germany, going back to Tacitus's writings and all the rest, or wherever else they came from. What made Americans Americans is when the colonizer settlers first started crossing the Appalachian Mountains in the years after the Revolution and arriving in the Great Basin of the Mississippi River that fills most of the continent, and that they were then separated from the old feudal legacies and shadow of the old world with all its problems. And we're finally freed, according to Turner, in this Edenic environment to become true Americans. And he was, in a way, this is taking, again, the Bancroft vision of America as sort of a special and chosen place, but swapping out the idea that God and providence are guiding it. Instead, he was using what was then the most, vigorous and celebrated science of the day, the implications of Darwin's thesis. And he was particularly looking at how natural selection works and environmental selection, and believed that groups of people, when encountering a new environment, would adapt and be shaped by that environment. In other words, if you took a whole bunch of people of totally different backgrounds and put them in the same environment in Montana, they would all assimilate over time into a Montana adapted culture. And he believed that the West and Far West were where Americans adapted and became Americans, that they had to be self-sufficient and civic-minded and look out for each other and be democratic and leveled as a society, and were away from the taint of feudalism and all of the other things from the old world. However, he gave this thesis at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, and it took off. It went viral, as it were. Everyone was talking about it. It quickly transformed high school, textbooks, as high schools were first being created in the United States, the curriculum that people used, the way that academics taught and thought about American history suddenly became about the frontier. And that frontier experience, from Davy Crockett, through, Andrew Jackson to, fictional people like John Wayne, all of that drew on the idea that it's the frontier that made Americans truly American. Took off went crazy, was absolutely everywhere, made him a superstar, even though he was an unknown professor at the University of Wisconsin. But here's the rub. Turner quickly, himself realized after giving this paper that he was wrong about all that. I mean, he was a procrastinator as a writer, but a obsessive compulsive researcher. He loved research. He filled entire, filing cabinets and rooms with research for articles that he never got around to writing because he was so involved in it. And he was taking the early sciences of, cartography and government maps and soil maps and settlement maps and trying to prove his frontier thesis after giving this sort of white paper at this conference that went crazy, and hopefully putting it into book form. But he quickly discovered the data wasn't supporting it. Almost any way he sliced and diced and looked at it, the settlement streams that were coming into the Midwest and the West, the ones starting in New England and the New Englanders' descendants who colonized upstate New York after the Dutch defeat in the 1660s, who went on to colonize the Western Reserve of Ohio. In other words, the part of Ohio that had been claimed as the Western Reserve of Connecticut and was settled by New Englanders, unlike the rest of Ohio, and whose political behavior today on county maps is radically different than the other sections, to Michigan and Wisconsin. That Yankee settlement stream persistently voted and behaved in almost any way he looked at it differently from, say, the Scots-Irish Appalachian settlement stream, who came out of Virginia into Kentucky and then, rafted down the Ohio River, settling both banks to settle, the southern tiers of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and large parts of Missouri and so on, a very different culture. And so he began to realize that that the different sections of the United States are what appears to be determinative and can even push back on the natural environment. But he never got around to writing that book, unfortunately. He tried for the whole rest of his life for decades, but it never actually came together. And on his deathbed, it was still unfinished. But that was Turner's legacy, as a thesis that even he himself came not to believe in, but which has stayed with us, ever since. I think we may have technical trouble here. You back?
Yep, sorry. I'm not sure if that was me or you, but there we go.
What part did you lose me on? Is there anything I should revisit, or can we carry it on?
No, I think I only lost about 30 seconds. So,
good.
So we're good.
Excellent. So that ends with, so essentially, Turner's, was kind of like, a rock band who early in their career has #1 hit. And
everyone wanted to hear the closing of the frontier, right?
Exactly. He went on concert, went on tour for years in scholarly circles and everywhere else. And nobody wanted to hear his new material. They all just wanted to hear about the frontier thesis, even though he knew it was wrong. And it's carried on and is still, while discredited in academic circles, elements of that idea of the American frontier and the West and all of that made America what it is still with us in our cultural psyche in any case, even if its own creator knew very promptly that it actually wasn't supported by the evidence. But I mean, he was trying to write American Nations. I didn't realize that, of course, because I didn't know that Turner had done this, right? I used the frontier thesis guy. So you can imagine my shock when I was reading his quotes. I was, he's looking at maps and he's pointing out things I pointed out in the book a century later, not even knowing he'd done that. But
well, at least he didn't contradict you, right? So
thank goodness, right?
Yeah. So the last character is in many ways the villain of your book, and I think for those watching or listening who are foreign policy specialists, it may be striking that this particular person is depicted in villainous ways, although I think it's very deservedly so in the context of your story, and that's Woodrow Wilson.
Absolutely. So, if it's said that the South lost the Civil War but won the peace, the moment when the South really puts its crowning, keystone of victory on that project is when Woodrow Wilson ascends to the White House. Because, Woodrow Wilson was very much a deep Southerner, with that entire tradition going back to Sims and its views on nationhood. He grew up in Augusta, Georgia. His father was the leading figure in the Confederate Presbyterian Church, author of a widely celebrated essay and sermon about how slavery is ordained by God and is the way it should be, a virulent white supremacist who Wilson adored and considered the most influential person in his life. They moved to Columbia, South Carolina after the war. Columbia had been burned by Sherman's army, and his father was a figure in the theological seminary there, and he grew up in the aftermath of Reconstruction and carried that idea of a white supremacist, Anglo-Saxon oriented ethnostate in his mind and put it down very clearly in all of his letters, but all of his academic writing, in the books he wrote before he and when he got to Princeton, and consistently set forth in his story that, obviously people are not equal. Certain people aren't made for the American project. That the KKK's reign of terror to stop Reconstruction and to reverse the political emancipation of African Americans was a good thing. That the whole idea that African Americans could be equal members of the Republic had clearly been a naive idea, and that order was restored by the good old folks of the Klan. All of that's in his histories, the histories that he was celebrated for, the history of the American people, and his books on the aftermath of the Civil War. So he then ascended, of course, to the governorship in New Jersey briefly, and then to the presidency, where he brought in a almost all Southern administration for the first time. He was the first deep Southerner to ascend to the presidency since the Civil War, in fact, ever at that point. And it was greeted in the inauguration. People were writing about how, Dixie had been rehabilitated. And he promptly segregated the federal government, the union government, on racial lines, started, creating for the first time separate bathrooms and moving people out of offices and purging the administration in Washington, the civil service of African Americans. But further, it's reflected, and this audience will, appreciate that, in his foreign policy. I mean, we know him for his ideals towards internationalism and the self-determination of peoples. But what is not mentioned is that, he argued for self-determination for the former colonial subjects of the Axis powers in Europe, but against it for the former subject peoples in the Middle East and in Micronesia and in Asia and elsewhere, who were placed in a hierarchical racial structure into different levels of mandates based on the tutelage they would clearly require to become self-governing people, class A, B, C, and D mandates. At the peace conference itself, the effort to include as an additional act in his covenant for the League of Nations, that there be a principle of not having racial discrimination, at least against members of other League of Nations states when visiting your country. This was put forward by the Japanese, who were an ally in World War I and were at the peace conference. It was passed in the proper committee. I can't remember, 9-3. And Woodrow Wilson, who chaired this committee, declared it had not passed, that it needed a unanimous consent, even though it didn't. And in fact, they'd already passed other things without unanimous consent because he considered it to be too important. He personally intervened and brought down that. And finally, and probably with the most implications, he, during a time when there were enormous protests and civil actions in the streets about the future direction of the United States, about whether we were going to ultimately be a white supremacist state or a civic national one. There were enormous protests during his administration with the release of the first Hollywood blockbuster film, the film that created Hollywood. The filming of it in a little village outside LA caused the beginning of the movie industry there, and that film was The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith. But it was co-produced by and based on a book, The Klansman, by one of Woodrow Wilson's closest friends, Thomas Dixon Jr., a classmate of his and Frederick Jackson Turner together at Johns Hopkins at their history seminar. And this film was imperiled. It had cost a staggering amount of money to make. It had done technical things nobody had done before. Instead of being a 10-minute flicker, as they called them, this film, lasted for hours with an intermission in the middle. It had involved thousands of extras. It cost, gazillions of dollars in equivalent in 1915. And the problem was that, rightly, African Americans and others who valued the civic national tradition were blocking this outrageous film, which celebrated, the whole story of the film is celebrating the Ku Klux Klan as heroes for rolling back the emancipation of non-white people in the South. That's the film. The Klansmen in their robes are on the promotional movie theater things. As the movie was opened in different cities, there were people dressed as Klansmen giving out, the brochures and at the ticket windows as part of the promotions. Mm-hmm. And enormous protests formed in New York and Boston and other cities to stop the film. And in this time period, the Supreme Court of the United States had not yet ruled that artistic productions are protected speech under the First Amendment. So mayors and governors regularly censored productions considered to be contrary to public order and peace. And the protesters wanted the mayors in New York and Boston and other major cities to do exactly that. And the mayors were considering doing it. If that had happened, it would have bankrupted Griffith and Thomas Dixon Jr. They owed so much money, and if those major markets for film were lost, they had no chance of recovering it. And so they did a Hail Mary pass. Dixon went to his friend Woodrow Wilson in the White House, who agreed in the middle of all of this, and at this critical juncture, to screen it in the White House for his entire cabinet. And on the strength of that, the next morning, Dixon went across the street to visit the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice White, and asked him if he would screen it. And when Justice White heard what it was about, he said absolutely, because he'd been a Klansman and thought the story was great, and showed it in the greatest ballroom in Washington, D.C. for the other Supreme Court justices and all of the leading figures in Congress. And of course, once you've done that, the tacit endorsement of the film by all of the leading figures in Washington, that carried the day and caused the film to be able to spread forth, and spread forth it did. I mean, that film single-handedly inspired the creation of the second Ku Klux Klan and all that followed. Mm-hmm. It was just the night before it premiered in Atlanta, in preparation for the film appearing, is when the founders of the second Klan climbed up on a mountain and burned a cross and then rode into town in their robes to seize the pop culture moment of this film. So it was a rallying cry ever since. So what I'm saying is that Woodrow Wilson was very much the crowning figure of the ethno-national project in the country. And the reason that you mentioned this earlier, why does the book stop where it does, right? The book begins with a young George Bancroft arriving at Harvard as a young man, and it ends in Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And the reason is the goal of the book was to tell the story of where the US national story first came from. And of course, I quickly discovered that there was this contest starting right at the beginning between these two forces. So I wanted to carry the narrative until one of these two narratives had clearly won a national consensus and was sort of the undisputed story of what the country was across the Federation, not just in the South and not just in the North. Mm-hmm. And so it's under Woodrow Wilson's presidency that one of those visions won. And for the first time, the whole country, was speaking from the same, general stance on what how our nationhood should be defined. And unfortunately, that stance was this ethno-national one. Mm-hmm. That, of course, changed later after World War II. But, the legacy again of this, bad part of our history includes absolute periods of decades where it was absolutely triumphant across the entire Federation. And that's how powerful a demon it has been in our past and why we're still fighting these battles today.
Sure. Well, Colin, this has been fascinating. We've got a little under 10 minutes left. So I got a couple quick questions. First, sticking to the 19th century, I'm just curious on the choices of characters you made, because when you were starting out this project with your blank canvas, how did you pick these folks? Because you obviously left some pretty prominent people, on the cutting room floor, so to speak, like an Abraham Lincoln, for example. Right. So talk a little bit about that. And then the second part of the question is then pulling it forward. As you say, you ended in the Wilson years. This debate about America and its and who we are as a country is still very much alive today. And if you were to pull the story forward, maybe write volume 2 of this book, who are some of the characters that you would like to highlight?
For sure. I mean, briefly, the characters I wanted to choose, the first effort was empirical, trying to figure out where the first chunky story emerges, and I quickly ran into Bancroft. And it didn't take me long to, as I was, watching how that unfolded and how it was disseminated and embraced and why, and how it kind of got into the public consciousness, you quickly encountered Sims and the other Southern critics of it. And so that dynamic was already there. The other characters were chosen as the battle between those two visions unfolded. Who were if you were to pick 5 or 6 characters, who were the ones who most explicitly were making an argument as to what United States nationhood was, right? There are all sorts of people whose efforts contributed enormously to the materials at hand and the argument as to who we should be, but not very many people were explicitly trying to answer that question. And so this is a book about that. So those became the primary characters, and many other people from, Abraham Lincoln, who's influenced by Bancroft. Bancroft and Douglas both visit Lincoln and occupied Washington multiple times to try to get him to defend the civic national tradition at a time when Lincoln wasn't sure. People like, Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony and Mary Staton and all these other figures are in the book. John Brown, so many people played a role, but they weren't as their sort of primary thing arguing a story of our nationhood. So that's what separated the two out. And unfortunately, for instance, there aren't any women in that grouping. There's a lot of people not in that grouping because that 19th century internet of ideas I described, the stages that allowed you to have a place at that and start being, retweeted by the newspapers and become part of it, they were exclusionary. They're exclusionary today. They were more so in the 19th century. And so it was very hard to get on them. So it's not surprising that many people, who didn't have the full rights as, especially white Anglo-Saxon men, and Frederick Douglass, because just the force of his personality, he got on that stage, but many people could not. And then the second question is a really interesting one. If one had a sequel book or carried it forward, who would the characters be? Briefly, the story thereafter is, in fighting World War II and especially the Cold War, first you had troops returning, including African-American troops from World War I and then from World War II, where they'd, given their lives to their country, and then they returned to the Jim Crow South. And they've seen firsthand, perhaps the first time in their lives, been in environments where they weren't treated as a subordinate caste. In occupied France, in Hawaii on your way out to fight in World War II, in environments where the caste system was not in place like that. And that, of course, that was one force, but at the same time, from the positions of power, fighting World War II, and then especially the Cold War, we were in a battle in the Cold War especially, and certainly in World War II, for the hearts and minds of people in a proxy war in what was then called the Third World, right? The battle between the Soviet Union and the United States was largely being fought in non-white countries, where the Soviet Union in this existential struggle was able to say, look, and they were able to say accurately in their propaganda, look, people in this African country or that Middle Eastern country, if your diplomats go to Washington and they try to go to a beach in the height of the summer before air conditioning, they will be turned away based on their race. They won't be able to get a meal if they try to drive from DC to Richmond on the highways because they're all segregated. That America is a lie in that respect. Come, we in Moscow have your interests in mind, and we don't believe in any of those things. They were able to make those propaganda arguments, and that had gotten the attention of Eisenhower and others who were responsible for, winning and surviving the Cold War, and made them amenable, but also prioritizing the fact that this had to change. So both the United States, for geostrategic and national security reasons, had a reason to, at the top of power, to want to change this, and from the bottom, the ultimately Gandhi-esque movement in the Deep South, led by Martin Luther King, those two were able to come together at the same moment to bring a triumph of the civic national tradition for the first time. which is what I, as a Generation Xer, and maybe many in the audience, grew up with that tradition as obviously ascendant. You know, we had problems in the past, but, you know, we're moving step by step towards achieving the ideals and Declaration of Independence. You know, look, we elected Barack Obama's been elected twice to President of the United States. You know, we're doing it. And obviously that the other tradition has not been vanquished the way that one might have thought then. So the lessons going forward, you know, the book contains, we need a national story in the United States if we're to survive as a federation, given our balkanized nature, but also, you know, to function and survive, period, requires, you know, a embracing of what holds us together in that ideals and civic national front, because that's the tradition we have available to us that has depth and credibility going back in time of the sort that humans need to, you know, have allegiance to something as abstract as a nation that, you know, can allow us to move forward. And so revisiting that and revisiting the ingredients we have to build a national story going forward are desperately needed in these divisive times within this country.
That's a terrific point, because obviously the debate about who we are as a nation is something we are now still living every day. And in fact, it's a never-ending project, to be sure. And your book gives us critical context as well as the backstory for much of the debates that we're seeing unfold every day about which statutes we decide to uphold, to what school names are, to the political ideas that our politicians are promoting. Colin, we are out of time. I could go on for another hour talking to you. This has been a fascinating conversation. I guess I'd like to ask one last question, though. And that's, what surprised you the most in writing this book?
I guess,
as we said at the very outset, no, I was saying you've studied this deeply in this third book here of a trilogy of the regionalism and American character, and now this idea of union. You know, this has been a journey of discovery. You've learned a lot of new characters, new things. What surprised you?
I think that the biggest surprise was that ethno-national vision was created and articulated and stepped on the stage so early, like as early as the civic national one, and that it really goes back that far and has had that level of success and influence for so long, you know, an equal contender to the other vision from the beginnings. And that's, you know, it's sort of depressing, but an awfully good thing to know, and explains a great deal about how that could still have legs in a republic supposedly devoted to these ideas in the Declaration. So I think that was the big surprise. In terms of minor surprises, all sorts of things and twists
on
and
every page, right,
of these characters, and who knew who and who was influenced by what, and what the times were like. There were revelations constantly, which I hope the readers enjoy as they unfold during the course of the narrative.
Absolutely. Well, I'm quite confident readers will enjoy this book. I did immensely. We unfortunately left a lot of questions in the Q&A unanswered, so I'm sure you can get in touch with Colin and he'd be happy to answer those. And I really, again, recommend this book, Union, by Colin Woodard. It's a terrific story. It's very well told. And even though it's about events and people from the 19th century, it is incredibly relevant for today. So Colin, congratulations on the book. And thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you all for having me, and all of you in the audience for spending this hour with us.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. And for those of you interested, we will be posting this on YouTube, so you can watch it later if there's some parts you want to rewind and hear again. Thanks, everyone. Please take care and stay safe.
Thank you.